They were confident the convoy would reach its destination. In late February 1943, Japanese naval officers planning Operation 81 had carefully calculated the risks. 8 destroyers would escort 8 transports carrying nearly 7,000 troops across the Bismarck Sea from Rabaul to Leh. The journey covered roughly 250 miles and was expected to take 3 days. They planned to travel mostly at night, sticking close to the northern coast of New Britain, where weather and terrain might offer some protection. The troops on those transports were desperately needed. The 51st Division, battle-hardened veterans who had fought in China and Manchuria, would reinforce the garrison at Leh on New Guinea's northern coast. Without them, the Japanese hold on eastern New Guinea would collapse. With them, the defensive line might hold long enough for Japan to consolidate its positions and possibly force a negotiated peace. On the morning of March 3, 1943, Allied reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy about 50 miles north of Cape Gloucester. The weather was clearing, clouds that had provided cover overnight were dissipating. Squadron leader Bill Benn, piloting a B-24 Liberator from Port Moresby, radioed the sighting at 8:90 hours. 8 large transports, 8 destroyers heading southeast at approximately 7 knots. At Allied Air Force headquarters in Port Moresby, General George Kenney received the report within minutes. This was the chance he had been waiting for. For months, Japanese convoys had slipped through under cover of weather and darkness to reinforce their garrisons. This time, the conditions were different. Clear skies, ready squadrons, specially modified aircraft, and pilots trained in a new technique the Japanese had never faced, one that would make conventional anti-aircraft defense nearly useless. On board the destroyer Shikanami, the Japanese convoy commander knew Allied aircraft were coming. The questions were when and in what numbers. His anti-aircraft crews were at their stations, the formation tight to allow overlapping fields of fire. The ships carried hundreds of 25mm Type 96 anti-aircraft guns, capable of firing up to 260 rounds per minute at medium to high-altitude aircraft. The doctrine was sound, proven in countless battles. Attacking planes could be engaged at range, giving gunners time to track, calculate lead, and concentrate their fire. Dive bombers were highly vulnerable during their attack runs, exposed and forced into predictable flight paths. Torpedo bombers, approaching low and slow, made perfect targets for concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese Navy had used these tactics to shoot down hundreds of Allied aircraft. But what was about to happen over the Bismarck Sea would defy expectation. The Allied planes approaching the convoy were not flying at medium altitude. They were not dive bombing. They were not making traditional torpedo runs. Instead, they came in at masthead height, at speeds nearing 300 mph, with forward-firing guns capable of shredding ships before anti-aircraft crews could react. The Japanese convoy was about to face skip bombing and strafing attacks on an unprecedented scale, and the men packed below decks with their equipment had no idea what was coming. The battle over the Bismarck Sea was no random encounter. It was the result of strategic pressures that had been mounting since Japan's southward advance stalled in mid-1942. After defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, Japanese forces in the Southwest Pacific were stretched thin, holding positions that required constant reinforcement but lacked secure supply lines. Leh on New Guinea's northern coast was one such critical position. The town itself was modest, once a gold mining center, but its location made it strategically vital. Leh sat at the base of the Huon Peninsula, controlling access to the Markham Valley and the interior of New Guinea. Japanese forces used it as a staging area for operations against Port Moresby and as an anchor for their defensive perimeter, protecting Rabaul, the massive base complex on New Britain that served as the hub of Japanese operations in the region. By early 1943, the garrison at Leh was in serious trouble. Allied air attacks had made resupply nearly impossible. Troops were short of food, ammunition, and medical supplies, while disease ran rampant in the jungle environment. Combat losses had thinned infantry units, and intelligence reaching Rabaul warned that the Australians were preparing an offensive that could overwhelm Leh's defenders unless reinforcements arrived quickly. The Japanese army chose the 51st Division for this mission. These were seasoned soldiers, not raw recruits. They had fought in the Second Sino-Japanese War, taking part in operations across Manchuria and northern China. The men were seasoned, disciplined, and used to enduring harsh conditions. Their commander, Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano, trusted that his troops could hold Lai and perhaps even push the Allies back if they received proper support. The plan involved moving nearly 7,000 men, along with their weapons, ammunition, and supplies, from Rabaul to Leh in a single convoy. 8 transports would carry the troops: Eyomaru, Kembumaru, Kyokusmaru, Owawamaru, Shinimaru, Ta-maru, Teomaru, and Nojima. These were not warships but converted merchant vessels, cargo ships, and passenger steamers pressed into military service. Slow, unarmored, and vulnerable, they were nonetheless all Japan could provide. 8 destroyers would serve as escorts: Shikinami, Oranami, Asagumo, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Shirayuki. Fast and heavily armed, these fleet destroyers were capable of defending against surface threats and offering anti-aircraft protection. Each carried multiple 25mm anti-aircraft guns in twin and triple mounts, as well as heavier 12.7mm main guns that could target low-flying aircraft. The convoy was scheduled to depart Rabaul on the evening of February 28, 1943, traveling at night whenever possible to reduce exposure to Allied air reconnaissance. Its route would take it north of New Britain through the Bismarck Sea, then south along New Guinea's coast to Leh. Japanese planners expected the journey to take about 3 days. They anticipated Allied air attacks but believed the destroyer escort would provide sufficient protection. This confidence came from experience. Japanese naval forces had successfully run similar convoys despite Allied air power. Standard Allied bombing tactics, high-altitude level bombing, and medium-altitude attacks by dive bombers and torpedo planes had proven relatively ineffective against maneuvering ships with strong anti-aircraft defenses. Ships could evade bombs dropped from altitude, while anti-aircraft fire had downed numerous torpedo bombers before they could release their weapons. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized layered anti-aircraft defense. Ships in convoy formation would concentrate their fire, forming a protective barrier that aircraft had to penetrate. Gunners trained constantly, tracking fast-moving targets and coordinating fire with other ships. The 25mm guns were reasonably effective, with a maximum range of about 3,000 meters and the ability to engage aircraft up to 5,500 meters in altitude. Planners were aware that Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific were growing stronger. American and Australian squadrons were receiving new aircraft and expanding their bases, increasing the threat to any Japanese convoy. But Japanese intelligence had not detected the tactical innovation that Allied commanders had been developing specifically to target ship convoys. They were unaware of the modified aircraft, the specialized training, or the new attack profile that awaited them. Across Port Moresby and forward bases throughout Papua New Guinea, Allied air crews had been preparing for exactly this kind of mission. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, had recognized that conventional bombing tactics were insufficient for striking ships. He personally oversaw the development of skip bombing, a method where bombs were released at extremely low altitude, causing them to skip across the water like flat stones and hit ships at or near the waterline. He also directed aircraft modifications, adding forward-firing machine guns to bombers to suppress anti-aircraft fire during attack runs. The stage was set for a clash between traditional naval doctrine and innovative air tactics, between seasoned Japanese defenders and aggressive Allied air crews trained specifically to destroy convoys. The Japanese convoy from Rabaul carried men who trusted their ships and escorts. The Allied squadrons preparing to strike carried pilots who believed they had finally discovered a reliable way to sink ships from the air. One side's confidence was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The 8 transport ships carrying the 51st Division's troops were not built for combat. They were merchant vessels designed for cargo and passengers in peacetime, now pressed into military service because Japan's purpose-built troop transports had been sunk or were committed elsewhere. Understanding the nature of these ships is crucial to understanding what happened when Allied aircraft engaged them. The Ayamaru, the largest transport in the convoy, displaced approximately 6,900 tons. Built in 1920 as a passenger cargo vessel, it had been requisitioned by the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1941. Its riveted steel hull, typical of merchant construction of the era, had no armor plating. Bulkheads were designed to contain cargo, not resist explosions. Below the main deck, troops were packed into holds originally intended for freight, with makeshift bunks and minimal ventilation. The Kembu Maru was smaller, displacing about 5,000 tons. Built in Scotland in 1921, it had operated as a civilian cargo carrier until the war. Its engines were aging, limiting its maximum speed to barely 12 knots. Approximately 1,000 troops were crammed below decks in conditions that would be considered inhumane by any standard. Space below decks was so limited that men had to sleep in shifts. There wasn't enough room for everyone to lie down at once. Each transport carried not only troops but also their equipment and supplies, artillery pieces, machine guns, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and spare parts, all packed into holds and lashed to decks. The total cargo across the 8 transports represented months of Japanese production capacity. Ammunition manufactured in arsenals in Japan and shipped to Rabaul, food stockpiled through the empire's strained logistics network, and weapons that could not easily be replaced. The destroyer escorts were far more formidable. The Shikanami, flagship of the squadron, was a Yugure-class destroyer launched in 1937. She displaced 680 tons at standard load and could reach 34 knots at full speed. Her main armament consisted of 5 12.7 cm guns in single turrets, capable of firing 15 Kielig shells at roughly 10 rounds per minute. For anti-aircraft defense, she carried 2 twin 25mm gun mounts plus additional single mounts, giving her between 8 and 12 anti-aircraft guns depending on configuration. The other destroyers in the escort were similar, fast, heavily armed, and designed to put up significant anti-aircraft fire. The Yukikaze, which would later survive the war as one of the luckiest ships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, mounted similar weaponry. The Asagumo and Arashio were slightly older but equally capable. Together, the 8 destroyers formed a strong escort force, able to put hundreds of rounds per minute into the air against attacking aircraft. Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine emphasized maintaining formation to allow overlapping fields of fire. Each ship's director assigned firing sectors, leaving no gaps. The 25mm guns used tracer ammunition so gunners could observe impacts and adjust fire. The doctrine stressed volume over precision, relying on the sheer number of rounds to hit or deter attackers. This approach had worked well against attacks previously encountered. High-altitude bombers could be engaged at range, giving gunners time to track and calculate. Dive bombers were exposed during attack runs, committed to predictable flight paths. Torpedo bombers had to approach slowly at low altitude to deploy their weapons accurately, making them easy targets for concentrated fire. But the attacks the Allied air forces were planning would not follow any of these familiar patterns. The modified aircraft waiting at Port Moresby and the forward bases had been configured specifically to strike ships at wave-top height, moving so fast that Japanese anti-aircraft crews would have almost no time to react. The B-25 Mitchell medium bombers had undergone major changes. Standard B-25s carried a single 75mm gun in the nose for ground attack, but these versions, nicknamed commerce destroyers by their crews, carried 8 fixed 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, 4 on each side, all firing straight ahead. In an attack run, those guns could rake a ship's superstructure with a wall of fire, killing anti-aircraft crews and suppressing defensive fire during the seconds that mattered most. The A-20 Boston attack bombers, known as Havocs to the Australians, had received similar upgrades. Fast, maneuverable, and armed with 8 forward-firing 50 caliber guns, they could strafe with precision while closing in at nearly 300 mmars. Skip bombing, the technique that would change everything, required disciplined practice and exact timing. Pilots had spent weeks training over water near Port Moresby, learning to hold the perfect altitude, usually between 200 and 300 feet, and the perfect speed, fast enough to cross the target quickly, not so fast that the bomb site became useless. The bombs themselves were typically 500-pound general-purpose bombs with delayed fuses. Pilots released them at the last possible moment between 200 and 400 yards from the target. Dropped at that height and speed, the bombs would skim across the water like a flat stone thrown by a child, keeping their velocity. If the pilot had judged the run correctly, the bomb would slam into the ship at or just below the waterline, right where the hull was weakest. The delayed fuse allowed the bomb to punch through the hull before exploding, causing catastrophic internal damage instead of just tearing a hole in the side. Allied intelligence knew the Japanese transports were unarmored merchant ships. They knew the destroyers, though capable, had been built for surface combat first and anti-aircraft work second. They also knew convoy speed would be slow, around 7 to 10 knots, making the transports easy targets compared to fast maneuvering warships. What the Allied planners did not fully grasp was just how destructive their new tactics would be. Skip EIs. Bombing had been tested in training and used in a few small attacks on coastal vessels, but never against a large convoy under full fighter cover, with bombers striking in coordinated waves. The pilots believed they could sink ships. They did not yet know they were about to exceed their own expectations. Meanwhile, the Japanese troops packed below decks in those 8 transports went through their daily routines, unaware that an entirely new kind of attack was being prepared for them, one their ships and escorts had never trained to face. They ate rice and fish, they cleaned their weapons. They spoke quietly about what they planned to do once they reached Leh. A few wrote letters that would never find their way home. They trusted the destroyers guarding them to keep enemy aircraft at bay. That trust was about to face the harshest test imaginable. The planes heading toward the Japanese convoy were not ordinary bombers on routine missions. They were the result of months of trial, adjustment, and focused training, an answer to a problem that had frustrated Allied commanders since the first days of the Pacific War: how to sink ships from the air with reliability. The convoy was first sighted at 9:15 on the morning of March 3, 1943, by a B-24 Liberator on routine patrol. Squadron leader Bill Benn, flying the Liberator, kept his distance so the convoy wouldn't detect him while his navigator fixed their exact position. The convoy sat roughly 50 miles north of Cape Gloucester, moving southeast at 7 knots. Ben counted 8 large transports and 8 destroyers arranged in a tight defensive screen. The radio report went out instantly. At Allied headquarters in Port Moresby, operations officers snapped into action, coordinating the strike. The convoy lay about 200 miles away, close enough for aircraft to reach it in under 2 hours. Orders went to every squadron: prepare for immediate launch. This was the target they had hoped for. All across forward airstrips in Papua New Guinea, ground crews rushed to ready aircraft. Pilots grabbed their gear and sprinted to their planes. Engines rumbled awake across several fields as bombers and fighters lined up for takeoff. The coordination required was enormous. Squadrons from separate bases, flying different aircraft, all needed to arrive over the target at nearly the same moment to carry out the attack exactly as planned. The first strike came that same afternoon, March 3rd. 8 B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers from the 43rd Bomb Group reached the convoy around 1500 hours. They attacked from high altitude, about 7,000 feet, releasing their bombs in standard level runs. The Japanese responded instantly. Destroyers weaved through the water, throwing up smoke screens. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Not a single bomb found its mark. But this first attack wasn't meant to sink anything. Its purpose was to pin down the convoy's position and force it to maneuver, slowing its advance toward Leh. In that, it fully succeeded. The convoy twisted repeatedly to evade the falling bombs. Its pace dropped as ships scattered, regrouped, then scattered again. Most importantly, the attack confirmed the convoy's exact position and course for the major strike planned for the next morning. That night, the Japanese destroyer crews stayed at battle stations. They knew more attacks were on the way. Anti-aircraft ammunition was handed out. Guns were checked again and again. Crews tried to rest in shifts, but nerves kept many wide awake. Deep inside the transports, troops heard bursts of anti-aircraft fire above them and felt the ships twisting through the waves, but they saw nothing. Packed tightly in dark holds, they could only wonder what was happening overhead. The night brought poor weather, rain squalls, low clouds, and shifting winds. The convoy commander hoped the storm would shield them, but by dawn on March 4th, the sky was beginning to clear. Visibility stretched farther every minute. The sea rolled with moderate 3 to 4 foot swells. Conditions were nearly perfect for a low-level air assault. The main attack began around 1000 hours on March 4th. The first aircraft to appear were Australian bow fighters from No. 30 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force. 12 aircraft raced in at wave-top height from the southeast. Japanese lookouts spotted them at roughly 5 miles out. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire immediately, but the bow fighters were closing at more than 300 miles per hour. They opened fire at about 800 yards. Their 20mm cannons and machine guns ripped into destroyer superstructures and transport decks. Tracers sliced across the water. Explosive rounds burst against steel plating. Japanese gunners exposed on deck were cut down or forced to dive for cover. The bow fighters roared past at mast height, lifting sharply to clear the ships. Before the Japanese crews could regroup, the B-25 Mitchells came in. 13 aircraft from the 90th Bomb Squadron, 3rd Attack Group, approached in a loose line abreast formation. Each plane carried 8 50 caliber machine guns in its nose and 4 500-pound bombs fitted with delayed fuses. The B-25s targeted the transports. Japanese gunners who survived the earlier strafing tried to fire back, but the B-25s unleashed too much firepower. 8 forward guns per aircraft, 13 aircraft firing at once. More than 50,000 rounds per minute poured into the convoy. Tracers filled the sky like a sheet of light. Shells slammed into superstructures, tore through crews, and ignited ammunition at gun stations. The bombs were released at roughly 200 yards. Pilots watched them drop cleanly from their racks, skid once or twice across the surface of the water, then smash into the hulls right at the waterline. The delayed fuses performed exactly as intended. The bombs struck the hulls and penetrated before detonating. Explosions ripped through the ships, blowing out bulkheads, igniting cargo, and killing men packed in. The holds. The transport Kyoku Maru took 3 hits in quick succession. The first bomb exploded in her forward hold, where troops and ammunition were stored, creating a massive blast that blew out the forward bulkheads and caused the bow to settle rapidly. The second bomb hit midship, penetrating the engine room and destroying her machinery. The third bomb struck aft near the steering gear. Within minutes, Kyoku Maru was dead in the water, listing heavily, with fires raging throughout her hull. The trained troops lost in the battle were similarly irreplaceable in the short term. The 51st Division had been an experienced formation. Replacing those men required training new recruits, a process taking months. By the time replacements were ready, the strategic situation had shifted. Positions the troops were meant to defend had already fallen, forcing new defensive lines to be established further back, closer to Japan's core territories. For Allied planners, the success at the Bismarck Sea validated the investment in air power and the development of new tactics. General Kenny's 5th Air Force received additional resources and aircraft. Skip bombing techniques were taught to new squadrons arriving in the theater. Coordination between different aircraft types, fighters, attack planes, and bombers, became standard doctrine for anti-shipping operations. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Japanese soldiers and sailors throughout the Pacific heard about the Bismarck Sea through informal channels, rumors, and letters from survivors. Official reports downplayed the disaster, but men in the field knew the truth. A sense developed that operating at sea was suicidal whenever Allied aircraft were present. Morale suffered, and assignments to garrisons accessible only by sea became particularly dreaded. Allied forces, especially air crews, gained confidence from the victory. Pilots who had doubted whether skip bombing would work in combat now saw its devastating effectiveness. The success reinforced the belief that Allied material superiority and tactical innovation could overcome any Japanese defenses. The battle also highlighted the vulnerability of unarmored transports to air attack. Converted passenger ships and cargo vessels had no defense against bombs and strafing fire. The crews of the transports were civilian sailors pressed into military service, not trained naval personnel. When attacked, they could not maneuver effectively or coordinate defensive fire. The ships simply burned and sank, taking their cargo and passengers with them. Japanese naval architects and military planners understood this vulnerability but could do nothing. Building armored transports was beyond Japan's industrial capacity and resource limits. The merchant fleet Japan possessed was the fleet it had to fight with, and it was fundamentally inadequate for operations in contested waters under hostile skies. After the Bismarck Sea, every convoy operation was conducted with the understanding that losses would be heavy if Allied aircraft encountered the ships in daylight. The battle marked a turning point in the Southwest Pacific campaign. Before Bismarck Sea, Japanese forces could still contest Allied advances, moving troops to threatened positions and maintaining defensive lines. Afterward, they were largely on the defensive, unable to reinforce adequately, and slowly losing ground as Allied forces advanced position by position. The strategic initiative had shifted irreversibly. Survivors of the Bismarck Sea convoy carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Men who spent hours in oil-covered water watching comrades drown could never fully process their experiences. Japanese military culture did not encourage discussion of trauma. Soldiers were expected to endure, maintain discipline, and continue serving without complaint. Yet the memories remained. Those rescued by destroyers and returned to Rabaul faced immediate reassignment. There was no time for rest or recovery. The war continued relentlessly. Men who had nearly drowned one week might find themselves on another ship or in a defensive position the next. Some survivors were sent to reinforce other garrisons, traveling by submarine or fast destroyer at night, always aware that daylight could bring the same deadly attacks they had already survived. A small number made it to shore on New Guinea or nearby islands, swimming through oil-slicked waters or clinging to debris drifting toward land. These men faced new challenges: enemy-controlled territory, no supplies, no support, and no clear way to reach friendly forces. Some were captured by Australian or American troops, while others tried to survive in the jungle, foraging to stay alive, hoping eventually to reach a Japanese position. Many perished from disease, starvation, or exposure before rescue arrived. Those who were captured provided valuable intelligence to Allied forces. Interrogators learned details about the convoy's composition, its intended destination, and what it was like to endure an air attack firsthand. Some prisoners, particularly after realizing the scale of Allied material superiority, were willing to discuss Japanese tactical doctrines and defensive measures. This intelligence informed future Allied operations and provided insight into Japanese military thinking. One captured officer, a company commander from the 51st Division, recounted being below decks when his transport was hit. The first sign was a tremendous explosion, felt more than heard, followed by darkness as the ship's electrical system failed. Water poured into the hold almost immediately. Men scrambled toward ladders leading to the deck, but the narrow passages and the crush of bodies made movement nearly impossible. Many were trampled or pushed aside in the panic. Those who reached the deck found the ship listing heavily, oil fires burning around the hull. The officer survived by jumping into the sea, swimming away from the burning ship, and was eventually picked up by a destroyer hours later. His account, recorded by Allied interrogators, reveals the psychological state of men who survived. He described feeling utterly helpless, unable to fight back, unable to see the enemy, unable to do anything except survive. This was not the way soldiers were meant to experience combat. Japanese military training emphasized aggression, attack the enemy, fight honorably, die if necessary, but always fight. Being killed passively, drowned in a hold, or burned by oil fires violated the warrior code instilled in every soldier from the first day of training. For Allied air crews, the aftermath was also complex. Pilots and gunners knew they had killed thousands, had seen ships explode and burn, and watched men jump into the water. Some had strafed lifeboats and survivors in the sea, following orders to prevent enemy troops from reaching shore. These actions were difficult to live with, even for men who understood the military necessity. American and Australian aircrew members spoke of the battle in later interviews and memoirs. Some expressed satisfaction at contributing to a decisive victory. Others were conflicted. One B-25 pilot described a strafing run on a transport, seeing men on deck clearly before opening fire. He knew they were about to die, but also that if they reached Lae, they would fight Allied forces, causing more deaths. The moral calculation was clear in military terms, but the human reality stayed with him. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea received widespread press coverage in the United States and Australia. It was presented as a major victory, evidence that Allied forces were gaining the upper hand in the Pacific. General MacArthur's headquarters released details about the battle, including the number of Japanese ships sunk and estimated casualties. Coverage highlighted Allied tactical innovation and the effectiveness of skip bombing techniques, providing encouraging news to the public at a time when evidence of progress was sorely needed. In contrast, Japanese media coverage was minimal and misleading. Official reports acknowledged the loss of some transports, but downplayed the scale of the disaster. The emphasis was on the heroism of crews and survivors, not on tactical failures or the strategic consequences. Japanese civilians reading these reports would not have realized that an entire convoy had been destroyed and that Japanese forces in New Guinea were now critically weakened. The disparity between Allied and Japanese reporting reflects broader patterns of wartime information control. Allied nations, particularly the United States, had relatively free press systems that reported victories in detail while being more cautious about defeats. Japanese media, tightly controlled by the government and military, presented only information that reinforced the narrative of inevitable victory and superiority. Citizens on both sides received filtered information, but the degree of filtering was far greater in Japan. For historians, the Bismarck Sea battle demonstrates the decisive power of tactical innovation. Skip bombing, combined with aggressive strafing to suppress defenses, solved the challenge of attacking ships effectively from the air. Coordination between different aircraft types maximized effectiveness, and the willingness to press attacks despite anti-aircraft fire ensured enough bombs hit their targets to destroy ships. Yet the battle also highlights the human cost of war. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died without firing a shot in their own defense. They were victims of strategic decisions made by commanders who underestimated Allied air power. Sent to sea in vulnerable ships without adequate air cover, they faced overwhelming odds. Their deaths achieved nothing strategically. Reinforcements never reached Leh, supplies were lost, and destroyers that could have been used elsewhere were sunk or damaged. From a purely military perspective, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a textbook demonstration of air power applied successfully against naval targets. From a human perspective, it was a catastrophe. Thousands of men died with no chance to fight back or survive. Both views are historically accurate, and both are essential to understanding what happened in the waters between New Britain and New Guinea in early March 1943. Survivors who lived through the battle and later the war carried those memories into peacetime. Some spoke about their experiences decades later, once enough time had passed to make discussion possible. Others never spoke, keeping those hours in oil-covered water to themselves. The psychological impact of surviving when so many perished, of feeling helpless under attack, and of watching friends and comrades drown stayed with them for life. The battle itself lasted only a few days, but its effects lingered for decades. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea also established principles that remained relevant long after the tactical situation of the Southwest Pacific in 1943 became history. The most fundamental lesson, air superiority over sea lanes, renders those lanes unusable for the side lacking air cover. This principle, proven at Bismarck Sea, shaped naval strategy for the remainder of World War II and into the post-war era. Throughout the remaining years of the Pacific War, every major amphibious operation, whether Allied or Japanese, included careful planning for air superiority. The U.S. Navy's fast carrier task forces, dominating the Pacific from mid-1944 onward, existed primarily to establish and maintain control of the skies over areas slated for amphibious landings or convoy operations. Japanese attempts to contest Allied advances without adequate air cover consistently failed, culminating in disasters such as the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, where Japanese carrier aviation was effectively destroyed. The skip bombing technique pioneered by General Kenny's air forces was studied and refined throughout the war. It was applied repeatedly against Japanese shipping across the Pacific theater. Other Allied air forces adapted similar low-level bombing methods for use in different theaters. British and American aircraft in the Mediterranean employed variants of skip bombing against German and Italian ships. The principle of approaching at wave-top height, minimizing the time available for defensive fire, became standard doctrine for anti-shipping strikes. The broader lesson about material superiority versus fighting spirit extended far beyond the Bismarck Sea itself. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spiritual strength, discipline, and a willingness to sacrifice as ways to offset material disadvantages. This doctrine was not entirely flawed. Well-trained, motivated troops with adequate equipment can defeat larger forces with poor training or low morale. But there are limits. When material disadvantages are overwhelming, when the enemy possesses 10 times as many aircraft, ships, or tanks, spiritual strength alone cannot compensate. Japanese soldiers and sailors across the Pacific often faced situations similar to those of the Bismarck Sea convoy. They were ordered to hold positions that could not be properly supplied, armed with outdated or insufficient equipment, and assured that fighting spirit would overcome Allied material superiority. Time and again, reality proved otherwise. American forces, backed by overwhelming numbers of ships, aircraft, and vehicles, supported by an industrial base Japan could never match, crushed Japanese defensive positions through sheer firepower. This does not diminish the courage or skill of Japanese forces. Many Pacific battles were intensely fought. Japanese defensive tactics, especially in the later stages of the war, inflicted heavy casualties on attacking American troops. Engagements like Eniwetok and Okinawa demonstrated that even with overwhelming material advantage, Allied forces paid a high price for victory. Yet the outcome was never in doubt. With sufficient resources committed, Japanese positions fell. The timeline might have been extended, casualties higher, but the result was predetermined by the material imbalance. For military historians and strategists studying the Pacific War, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea serves as a vital case study. It highlights the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance. The convoy was located and tracked by Allied patrol aircraft, enabling the concentration of forces for a decisive attack. It underscores the value of tactical innovation, with skip bombing proving far more effective than conventional bombing techniques. It illustrates the necessity of combined arms coordination, with fighters, attack aircraft, and bombers all contributing essential roles in the assault. Most importantly, it demonstrates the consequences of strategic overreach. By 1943, Japan was attempting to hold defensive positions across vast distances, from Burma to the Central Pacific to the Solomons. This required constant movement of troops and supplies through sea lanes increasingly dominated by Allied air and naval forces. The decision to send the convoy to Lae reflected military necessity, but it also exposed the fundamental vulnerabilities of Japan's overstretched empire. The garrison at Lae genuinely needed reinforcements, but the decision to send the convoy reflected more hope than sound strategy. Japanese planners wished the convoy would survive the voyage, but hope is not a substitute for strategy. The men who perished in the Bismarck Sea became victims of strategic decisions made without full understanding of the operational environment. Their commanders recognized that Allied air power was strong, yet they underestimated its effectiveness while overestimating their own defensive capabilities. In hindsight, the outcome was predictable. An unarmored, slow-moving convoy, attacked by hundreds of aircraft, employing tactics designed specifically to destroy ships, was doomed, but that foresight requires knowledge Japan's planners simply did not have. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea remains one of the decisive actions of the Southwest Pacific Campaign. It did not end the war or alter the ultimate outcome, determined by the Allied nations' overwhelming material advantage. Yet it accelerated the Allied advance, weakened Japanese defensive positions throughout New Guinea, and demonstrated a critical reality. Japanese forces could not hold territory without secure sea lines, and those lines could not withstand Allied air power. The convoy departing Rabaul on the evening of February 28, 1943, carried 7,000 soldiers who believed they were reinforcing a defensive position. They trusted their ships, trusted their escort, and believed their military's assurances that the convoy would succeed. By March 5th, most were dead, not in ground combat, but in ships burning and sinking under attacks they could not resist. Their deaths underscored a fundamental truth of modern industrial warfare. Conflicts between major industrial powers are ultimately decided by the side that can produce and deliver more weapons, ships, aircraft, and ammunition effectively. Individual courage, tactical skill, and operational competence matter, but they cannot overcome a sustained material disadvantage. The Japanese soldiers aboard those transports were as disciplined, as brave, and as committed as any in the world. But they were sent into a situation they could not survive, and they paid the ultimate price. Though the battle lasted only 3 days, its consequences echoed throughout the Pacific War. The tactical lessons learned, particularly the effectiveness of low-level, coordinated air attacks on shipping, influenced anti-shipping operations for decades to come. But for those who lived through it, whether in the air or below decks, the experience left an indelible mark on their understanding of war. Survivors carried the memories for the rest of their lives. Those who perished left behind families who received only vague notifications, with little insight into how or where their loved ones had died. Strategically, the battle was a clear victory for Allied forces and a devastating loss for Japan. Yet behind the numbers lay a human tragedy that no statistic can truly convey. Thank you for watching. For more in-depth historical analyses, explore the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.